Thank you very much, and it really is a great thrill to be here at many levels. Also, just see the turnout. This is really incredible, and I think it shows M.A.P.S Israel. And people are here to help, and to help our youth, which is really very inspiring. I'm both moved and impressed with this. I want to tell a little bit about my background and my connection to mentoring, and then we're going to start with the slideshow, which will be an introduction in general to the whole concept of mentoring. And it was just mentioned, this is where we're going nowadays. It's very important to understand a new shift that's taking place in mental health. We're going from a pattern of where, let's say, the school, the employer, the rabbi identifies someone and sends him to the practitioner, to bringing mental health into the school, into the community, into the home. A lot of talk nowadays about mental hygiene, mental health hygiene, where when we talk to our children, we give the Divrei Torah on Friday night, and we try to teach them a love for Torah and a connection with Yiddishkeit. We're also going to teach them about coping. We're going to take Torah sources, and maybe I'll cite some, and teach our children coping. So we're going in that direction, and mentoring is very much a part of that, where we're bringing mental health into the community. Now let me just give you a brief idea of how I think we can structure this, because we do have roughly, I think it's an hour and 20 minutes is planned for presentation, and then some Q&A. It actually reminds me, some of you may be familiar with the Mashgichim program, another great program in Torah Masorah, where I and a number of my colleagues are teaching Mashgichim in the yeshivas, mental health techniques, etc., because they're doing counseling services anyway, so they might as well know. And about a year ago, I did a presentation, and there's a group of people in the room, and then there's a Zoom with people on the camera. And at the end of my presentation, one of the people on the camera said, "Dr. Blumenthal, I have about 100 questions for you. Can I have your email address?" And I said, "Sure, dpelkovitz@gmail.com. So if we have questions, maybe we'll try to pause at certain points. People can ask questions during the presentation. If that does not work well, we can leave some time at the end for some Q&A. If some people are not comfortable getting up and speaking, if there's a few pens and pads around, write out your question and just pass on up front, and I'll read it so we have a chance to address those kind of questions. I will say one thing, that usually about the most interesting part of the presentations when I do presentations is, after it's all over, is the people who linger around to talk to me afterwards. That's usually when they come to tell me that they're the wrong gender or something like that. And it's interesting and it's helpful, but I do have to tell you that I have about a 2-hour trip home, and I'm not a spring chicken, so I'm going to have to leave right away. Save those precious questions for next time, or you'll have my email address, dpelkovitz@gmail.com. It's actually drnblumenthal@gmail.com. Please feel free to forward them to me, but I really don't have the luxury. In fact, one of my kids, when he always used to say that when he gets married, he wants to get married in Montauk. For those of you who don't know, Montauk is the very tip of Long Island. I live in Cedars. It's about 2.5 hours down to the end of Long Island. But he wants to get even with the Lakewood relatives, who make him always come out here for the simchas, so make them drive to Montauk, and when they're leaving early, say, "Oh, you're leaving early?" So anyway, so I really apologize, but I do have to make a quick exit. Let me tell you quickly about my connection to mentoring. This goes back, I'm guessing, maybe about 30 years ago. I was instrumental in starting the Kahal program in the 5 towns in West Hempstead. Those of you familiar, it's a partnership between the yeshivas with special ed classes. Once we had all the schools working together, we had another idea. We wanted to develop a vocational program for those kids who couldn't sit and learn, for those kids for whose school is toxic, let them learn a trade, let them learn plumbing, let them learn to be an electrician. So we came up with a name before we implemented. We called it TOVA, which stood for Torah Vocational Alternative, or Academy, I think, something like that. This created a lot of problems for those of us planning it, because when we were coming home late, and our wives, of course, well, I'm with Tova. That didn't go over big, but so we had to really make it clear. But the idea was great, but once we saw the expense of starting a vocational program, we had to abandon it. But that's when we came up with the idea of a mentoring program. But we liked the name Tova so much we kept it, so it became that was, I think, Torah is all, I don't remember what we did, but we came up, we somehow kept the Tova name. And until COVID, for about 25 years, we were doing mentoring. COVID, it fell apart. We've never really gotten it back on its feet. But there were 25 years where I was the clinical supervisor for the program. So mentoring is very close to my heart. And I have to say, the bang for the buck, there's nothing better. What for the expense, which was really nominal, and the impact that we made was really incredible. So I applaud you for doing this mentoring program, commend all those involved, and I hope I can be a piece of its development and give you, in part, the information. So let's start with what we're going to be talking about. Okay, so I'm going to go through the topics, and I'm going to be a little biased here, but I'll stay with the microphone. Okay. So let me just first tell you, it sounds like a lot. I'm not sure we'll get to everything, but we'll cover it pretty quickly. First, we're going to define mentoring. I'm going to give you just one slide on some of the data of the effectiveness of mentoring. We're going to differentiate between psychotherapy and mentoring. Oh, I can take one with me. I can take it home, right? Okay, very good. So we're going to, okay, so I can look here. Differentiate between psychotherapy and mentoring. I'm sorry, I can't point there. The different subtypes of mentoring, different types of mentoring, duration of mentoring. How long should mentoring be? How long should one be a mentor? Is there a minimum amount of time, which you'll see there is? Precautionary measures. You have to have precautionary measures in place. This might be already in place, but for the safety of the mentor and for the safety of the mentee. Consistency and boundaries, extremely important. What kind of supervision? Who are the candidates for mentoring? A developmental perspective. Why does mentoring work so well with kids? Mentoring for the treatment resistant, a very interesting idea. Those kids who need psychotherapy and refuse, and many do, is mentoring an alternative? Or is mentoring a segue into therapy when that's necessary? The emergence of a relationship, how does a relationship develop? The art of listening, the scope and limits of empathy. From that point, it's going to be pretty basic. Then we're going to get into some fancy stuff, if we have time. How many people here are mental health professionals? A handful, okay. Some of these concepts you'll be familiar with, but we're going to talk about the transitional object, the mentor as a transitional object, the issue of self-disclosure. Do you as a mentor share information about yourself when you're doing mentoring? Countertransference, which is the emotional reaction of the mentor towards the mentee, and different types of countertransference and how to use that. Goals and measurements of success. Is it a cure or mastery? And this is a very big question in mental health in general. Do we use an illness model? Do we cure people of depression? Or do we give people mastery over depression? A very interesting question, which we'll hopefully get to today, if not next time. And then the last thing is what happens if you need to make a transition to therapy. So that's what we're covering. Okay, those of you who've heard me present before know my obsession with cartoons, but this is probably where you feel right now. You are here. So first, let's start with a very basic definition of mentoring, okay? So the mentor is anyone, this is from, by the way, from Big Brothers, Big Sisters of America, who are the sort of founders of the whole mentoring format. But a mentor is anyone who has a beneficial life or style-altering effect on another person, generally as a result of personal one-to-one contact. So, okay, great. All right, great. So one definition focuses on it's a sort of relationship that has beneficial effects. It does not focus on any difference between the two. So that would be, in a way, sort of peer mentoring, where two people in a similar situation, maybe it's the premise of groups as well. So if two people are struggling, let's say with alcohol use, struggling with weight control, whatever it might be, are sort of in the same place and are helping each other in the process. That would be more of that kind of mentoring. And the other one, which is more relevant to what we're doing here, is one who offers knowledge, insight, perspective, or wisdom that is helpful to another person in a relationship which goes beyond duty or obligation, which is a situation where the mentoring is hierarchical. So let's say if we're talking about, some of the work I do at OHEL in bereavement. We are starting, I'm going to mention later, a mentoring program in bereavement. It would be somebody further along in the grieving process who would be mentoring someone who had a more recent loss. So there, it's, even though it's peer-to-peer, it's not professional, but it's someone who has a somewhat more of an advantage, is more in a more advanced place. So let's touch on the two aspects of mentoring. I'll start with just, I think when we talk about peer-to-peer mentoring, I want to reference a study that, again, those of you in the field probably know about, but a study that I think I quoted on a daily basis during COVID, which is the Steep Hill study. Are you familiar with the Steep Hill study? Yes. Somebody's, no, not. Okay. So what they did was they took college freshmen, and we love studying college freshmen because for $10 they'll do anything. And we took college freshmen and we took them to a very steep, I didn't do it, but other researchers did, took them to a very steep hill and gave them a very heavy backpack and told them they wanted them to climb this steep hill. But before they climb it, they wanted to estimate how hard it is to climb this hill. The only difference was that one group climbed it alone and the other one climbed it with a friend. And Cassader, the people who climbed the hill with a friend, estimated it as easier to climb than those who climbed it alone. Amen. So that's, in many respects, what mentoring, that's what you're doing, is you're helping people climb hills, even if it's peer-to-peer, you're helping them climb it together. In fact, I'll tell you that I'm doing a bereavement weekend, such as I do annually. I was doing a bereavement weekend this Shabbos. We specifically do weekends for parents, who lose adult children. And some people ask me what I do for these people on this weekend. So I tell them, imagine somebody carrying something, a very heavy package, something very heavy. So I take my shoulder and I take a corner of that package. And that's mentoring too. Okay, by the way, in case you're interested or you're playing Trivial Pursuit sometime, where does the word mentor come from? Well, it comes from Greek mythology. The story, the mentor was actually the name of someone from Homer's Odyssey, who Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, goes on to a war, and he trusts the care of his household to mentor the teacher and overseer of Odysseus' son. And then all sorts of things happen afterwards, but mentor actually was the name of the person who took care of his son. So useless piece of information, but if you're playing Trivial Pursuits and that comes up, or if any of you are still dating and you want to say, I always tell my students, I teach in the Smicha program at YU, and I tell them there's a condition called trichotillomania, which is someone who pulls out all their hair. And I tell them if you're on a date and you want to make a great impression, just sort of say trichotillomania. It makes it sound very smart. So similarly, if you want to sound smart, you can say where mentor comes from. Okay, now, again, the data. And this is data that's been collected by Big Brothers and Big Sisters of America. And this is the information in terms of people who are mentored. They are 46% less likely to begin using drugs, 27% less likely to begin using alcohol, 52% less likely to begin skipping school, 37% less likely to skip a class, and 33% less likely to hit someone. So there's some pretty impressive data, and I think we see it all the time. And I remember we saw it in the TOVA program as well, that by mentoring, in fact, the results of mentoring rival, if not surpass, that of psychotherapy. So I'm not saying we have to do away with psychotherapy, but it makes an incredible difference for people. And if any of you have been mentored yourself, in fact, we had a number of mentors in the TOVA program who were mentored in the earlier years of the program. It makes a really big difference. Okay, let's get a little idea of the difference between psychotherapy and mentoring. Okay, so first of all, psychotherapy is a medical treatment provided by a trained and state licensed professional. Psychotherapy is not just something somebody decides to do because they have a good feel for people. It's a medical treatment. It's considered a medical treatment, and therefore you have to get trained and licensed. Mentoring is a relationship based on guidance that is implemented by a peer who has more life experience or maturity. So it's not therapy. It's more guidance and direction or connection with that, but it's not a specific evidence-based technique. Okay? Next, psychotherapy is geared to heal a diagnosed disorder or condition. Okay, that's in other words, people come to therapy with a diagnosed condition. So it could be depression, anxiety, could be post-traumatic stress disorder, could be obsessive compulsive disorder, a specific disorder. Mentoring can be used in a preventative manner to boost one's resilience or expand coping through modeling. So it's more of a health-based, if you will, intervention, a preventative intervention. Psychotherapy is usually provided in an office or a clinic. Mentoring can take place in the community, school, or office, and we're going to mention that. Most mentoring takes place in the community, not in a specific professional office. Okay, psychotherapy is for a fee and with potential of insurance reimbursement if you're very patient. Mentors are usually either voluntary or paid by the community. And we'll talk a little bit later about the pros and cons of paid versus voluntary mentoring. Psychotherapy is mostly scheduled times with fixed durations. In other words, you have regular appointments with therapists. That's changing a little bit now because people have trouble affording it, so there's greater intervals or maybe doing more sort of on as needed basis. But generally the model is one, you've seen once weekly, you've seen bi-weekly. Mentoring may or may not be scheduled and can include more informal meetings. So the mentor would be somebody that potentially the mentee can call when they need. Maybe very much like, as we're going to reference later, the sponsor model in addiction treatment, where the addict can call his or her sponsor whenever they're on the brink of having a lapse. So there's not those kind of scheduled appointments. Psychotherapy employs evidence-based methods, which are mostly exploratory behaviorally prescribed. So I'm sure you've heard in psychotherapy that we're promoting evidence-based techniques. In other words, if you want to develop a certain type of psychotherapy, you have to do research to demonstrate that it's effective. In fact, again, I'm referencing the weekend we're doing this Shabbos. We have connected with a statistician and a researcher at Yeshiva University, and we're going to be doing a pre-weekend study and a post-weekend, later on study to see if it makes a difference. So that's evidence-based. We study the effectiveness. Mentoring can entail recreational activities, tutoring or homework help, and more informal interactions. You can study in mentoring. Mentoring has been studied, but it doesn't have, you don't have to prove that mentoring works or that this kind of mentoring works in order to implement it because it's not a medical treatment. Any questions so far? Everything okay? Okay, anybody want to leave? No, okay. All right, now here, let's talk about the different types. You think of mentoring, this, that. By the way, I will make this email, this PowerPoint available. We were trying now to see if I can email it out, but we'll make it available to you so you don't have to take pictures of slides and stuff like that. They'll be available to you. Now, probably the most commonly practiced, or probably the most popular, if you will, type of mentoring is the traditional one-on-one mentoring. So I'll read what I have here. Mentor and mentee are matched either through a program or on their own. Mentor-mentee partners participate in a mentoring relationship with structure and timeframes of their making or as established by a formal mentoring program. But it's basically probably the mentoring that's mostly being done. You're assigned a mentee, you're assigned someone who needs this kind of assistance, and you meet on some regular basis, one-to-one. You go for a pizza, you meet in a mall, you meet in a park, and you have some interaction exchanges. So that's tradition, that's the most common form of mentoring. Today, Baruch Hashem, we have Zoom, so there's remote mentoring, which is mentoring relationship for two parties or a group are meeting in different locations, sometimes called virtual mentoring. So you could be assigned a mentee in Nebraska, and you have contact online. And sometimes in those kind of arrangements, the mentor and mentee actually meet. In fact, just to show you the types of mentoring that takes place, I'm sorry to bring this up, but it's something we have to face. I have a patient who was a victim of an extramarital affair. Her husband had an extramarital affair. She found out. We're working on it, but she signed up for a mentoring program for women who have been victims of infidelity. And she was hooked up with someone, again, in the Midwest. And this is a frum woman, and this was some Christian woman in the Midwest. And she mentored her through this process of healing from that. And then she came into New York, and they got together. But that's remote mentoring. There's group mentoring, where a single mentor is matched with a cohort or pair of mentees. Now, sometimes, so in other words, this is where you're not mentoring an individual, you're mentoring a cluster of kids or individuals. So you may have a number of children, let's say a very common example, maybe struggling with Shmiras HaMitzvahs, or maybe, on so-called off the derech. And, so instead of mentoring one-on-one, you'll have 3 of them together. Or you'll mentor, in fact, again, we used to do this in the Torah program as well, where one mentor would take a few kids to amusement park or get together with them and do it as a group. So you have the peer support and the mentor's input. And by the way, sometimes that's a little easier to the mentee, especially for kids. So he's not having this another adult whom he thinks will be, reprimanding him or trying to correct him. Now he has the peer support as well. So sometimes that makes it more palatable. Now here's a fascinating type of mentoring. By the way, I want to thank 2 of my children for posing for the cartoon of the Adult Children of Normal Parents annual convention. There is what's called family mentoring. And I will tell you, we dabbled in that with Tova. We didn't really develop it fully, and it's a regret I have. But there's 2 types of family mentoring. So one type is really a mentoring where an individual actually sort of doesn't move in, but visits a family and gets it, where the mentoring is taking place not on a one-to-one, by the entire family. Now, this can be particularly useful if there is something about the home that's not working, for whatever reason. I don't want to be judgmental, but there's a dysfunctional parent. There is a parent that was incarcerated. There is a parent's preoccupied with some stressor that they're not so available to the other children. Not their fault. I mean, there's a sibling that's very sick or something like that. And there's something missing in terms of the family exposure for this child. So this child, this teen, will go to the family, or even an adult who may sometimes, I remember one patient I had whose parents were there was a very high level of marital conflict. And he told me, he's now an adult, but he told me when he was a kid, he used to study his friends' parents because he wanted to know what a normal marriage is. So instead of him having to do with friends, we would provide him with a family where he can see more normal interactions and exchanges. So that's one type. I have one problem with this type of family mentoring, which I've seen when it's been attempted, especially in our community, when parents, we have large families and mothers are sometimes overwhelmed, and sometimes this person is supposed to come and benefit from the exposure to a normal family, becomes another pair of hands to pick up the baby and to serve the food, and they become almost like, an assistant in the home, and they almost forget that there's a mentoring piece to it. You have to be careful about that. And by the way, I found that sometimes it's better that family mentoring should not be a family that's at that stage where they're just so overwhelmed. I remember when I was an intern, we used to get 4 weeks vacation. And my supervisor told me that he takes 2 two-week vacations. One, he goes away with his wife, that's vacation. One, he goes away with his family, that's called a family experience. It's not a vacation. But if you're having family experiences, you may not have the energy or attention to family mentoring. But then the other one that I think is fascinating, and we implement it, but not enough, is when one family mentors another family. Now again, we all know, every community has these families that are sort of teetering on the brink. There's mental illness in the family. There's poverty in the family. There's varying levels of dysfunctionality. The family itself is not functioning. Here's a case where sometimes a little older family that has more grown-up kids, is not as taxed, will take in this family. So they will visit the family and help them clean up the house or set up the home. They will have the family over for meals. They, as a family, take responsibility for the other family. And again, we can all identify those homes that need that kind of assistance, and that's a form of family mentoring. I remember one situation we had where the mentor family actually used to do the laundry for the mentee family because they didn't have, in their tiny apartment, they didn't have a washing machine dryer. To go to the laundromat was dangerous and was not always convenient. And so this mentoring family would pick up their laundry and do their laundry and bring it back for them, ad kadei kach. But again, that's another model of mentoring. And as I said, every community has those fringe families that could benefit from this kind of mentoring, and have the families that, Baruch Hashem, are really are functioning well, and may even have the luxury of having all the kids to, the time and the energy and the mind space to help others. Okay, any questions about any of that? Okay, so go ahead, I'm sorry. It's a very good question. If they do the other people's laundry and they're, Microsoft error report. Oh, God, no. Hold on a second. I'm sorry about that. This hasn't happened in a while. Okay. So yeah, is that mentoring? So that's a very good question. And I'm sorry about that. This happens sometimes. It hadn't happened in a while, so I thought I was, okay, let me just, hold on. Give me a second. So, as we're gonna cover soon. Okay, I don't know if it had anything to do with your question. Mentoring is a combination of advice and direction, as well as sometimes very pragmatic help. So, for example, a very popular form of school-based mentoring, which we're going to get to in a minute, is tutoring. It's helping the child with the work, but at the same time forging a relationship. So yes, you could say that's more maybe chesed, maybe that's, just, if all they were doing was the laundry, I would say you're right. But they were doing the laundry, they were still directing them, they were helping them, they were giving advice. They were, by the way, also in family mentoring as individual mentoring, when things seemed to fall apart. When a kid just wouldn't go to sleep and was screaming hysterically and the parents didn't know what to do, they would call these other set of parents for direction and how to handle the situation. By the way, all this also under the guidance and supervision of a mental health professional. So the family had a mental health professional, the mentoring family had a mental health professional to call and get advice how to handle the situations. So you're right, it wasn't just laundry. Frantic about where the next meal is coming from, you don't have the time or the patience to be an effective parent, and that can be relieved. And again, the family and we had that. Sometimes these families are wealthy themselves and would help, and sometimes they would go back to the local gemachs and say, we need to funnel some money this way. Okay, then there's school-based or community-based mentoring. So school-based mentoring is mentoring that takes place within the school. So it's mentors provided by a school, especially if there's a base of medrash or a comparable department in the school. So again, a lot of our high schools are attached to a base of medrash. So you have young, usually single or maybe recently married adults who are affiliated with the school, or I guess in the girls' program you might have recent graduates, and they mentor within the school. Then usually this is tutoring or homework assistance with a mentoring touch. So it would be the Rebbe from the base of medrash comes into the high school, learns with this individual, helps him with the Gemara, helps him maybe with secular subjects, and then after school, before coming home, takes him out for pizza. Or takes him out and throws a ball around and has opportunities to have a conversation. So it's a combination of being a sort of a teacher or that special Rebbe with the student, but it's done under the rubric of the school. And then you have some schools have the policy, especially in high school, where a senior will mentor a freshman. So the freshman is just coming into the school, is kind of overwhelmed, and is a senior who's already got it under his, has it under his belt, and he mentors, usually about school matters, he mentors the younger student, again, usually has to be with supervision. And so therefore very often you have actual teachers doubling as mentors. And we all know that if you have a yeshiva, if you have a mora or a mechaneches, or if you have a rebbe, they need sometimes supplemental income. Sometimes the supplemental income can be that they mentor talmidim. It creates a little bit of a problem if they're mentoring somebody in the classroom, and why are they mentoring this one and not the rest? And sometimes that can create complications. But that's a model as well, and it also provides an opportunity for the educator to make some extra money, which is always an issue. Community-based mentoring is where it comes, like in your case, where it's not you might have affiliated schools, but the mentoring is coming from the community itself instead of from within the school. And sometimes, by the way, there are benefits to that. If a kid is having a hard time in school If a kid is upset by the teacher, or Rahman al-Islam, the kid feels that the teacher's doing something inappropriate, it's going to be much easier to open up to the mentor who comes from the community than from the mentor that's affiliated with the school. So there's sometimes benefits that it's community-based, although it's logistically a little harder, but it's sometimes better if it's community-based, obviously with interacting with the schools, and also it feels more confidential and personal. So the child may feel more willing to open up. And then here we're talking, of course, child mentoring. Okay, and then there's situational mentoring. And this could apply to children, but could apply to adults as well. And by the way, just as an example, we have here the support group for forgetful people, and say, hi, my name is Bill, and I'm forgetful, and everybody says, hi, Carl. But again, it's very much like that sponsor model in the 12-step program. But situational mentoring is shared experience with a mentor having largely and fully emerged from what the mentee is still immersed in. So in other words, very much like the sponsor model of the 12-step programs. If you're familiar with the 12-step programs, so you have recovered alcoholics who are sponsors for recovering alcoholics. But you could have that in other situations as well. You know, you could have someone, another substance. You could have, let's say, someone who's getting over a gambling problem. I guess that's also an addiction. Or someone who has healed from a depression, mentoring someone who's still under treatment for depression. So they, on the one hand, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more, on the one hand, they understand it, they can relate to the situation, but it's also very good to show the person that there's, you know, you can be healed from this. There's light at the end of the tunnel. So it's demonstrated both by the presence of that person. So that's more situational. Again, very much the sponsor model of the 12-step programs. I'm going to share with you that OHEL is we're just about to launch what we call that Grief Companion Program. And the model was someone who suffered a loss, let's say somebody, Lower Lane, who lost a spouse at a young age or even at an older age. Someone loses a spouse, and there's someone else who had lost a spouse a year or two ago or 4 years ago. So we match them so they are companions, but usually with one who's a little further along in the comfort or consolation process than the one who had experienced the more recent loss. We were just about to launch it, but we found our lawyer, you know, God bless them, found out that there's a program in North Carolina that already has a grief companion program, and they trademarked it. And we couldn't come up with another name. So we called North Carolina, and they were like, from Christians, it was Machaya. And they were talking to them, we might partner with them. And this way we can use the grief companion name. We're in the middle of negotiations. But again, that's situational mentoring. It could also be survivors of abuse, trauma, grave medical illness, for example, cancer survivor may, who's already past that critical point, could mentor someone who was recently diagnosed. Mental illness, yeshiva education, all those kind of traumas. Nobody's even laughing. Okay, I'm sorry. I got it. Okay, yeah. All those kind of mishaps and terrible experiences that people go through to mentor them through it. Okay, so that's again, so the question was, we're talking about 3-4 years ahead of the process. What about if it's shortly ahead of the process? So it's a very good question, and that's those two definitions of mentoring. You could pair up two people who are in a similar place. And there's benefits to that because they validate what it's like, and whereas the person further ahead, it may be more of a remote memory, what it was like at that time. So that can work too, and there are benefits to it, but we generally find we find it's beneficial even when we do our groups, when there are people a little further along in the process. I mean, again, if you talk about some of these terrible losses that people experience, I don't have to even enumerate them. I'm sure you can imagine them. And very often the feeling is, I can't live. How am I going to go on? I can't get up in the morning. How am I going to manage? And seeing someone who's 3-4 years along the way, still in pain, but functioning, celebrating smachos, moving along, that's incredibly important to the more recently bereft. And similarly with these kind of stresses. In fact, I'll tell you an interesting story, which maybe I'll get back to later, but I'll reference it now. I was once supervising a female intern, Jewish, but not religious, but who was diagnosed with cancer when she was 12. She was diagnosed with ALL, those of you familiar with cancers, that's a highly treatable cancer. But she went through all the treatments. She waited that till she was fully in remission. She went to all the different programs and Make-A-Wish and all that. She went through the whole process. Today she's an adult, married woman, a mother, and she was assigned a 12-year-old who was just diagnosed. And she came to me in supervision, should I share my experience? Now, we came to the conclusion, interestingly, that yes, that would be very therapeutic. Let her see. You can survive it, you can go on with life, you can be a wife, a mother. And just about when we decided that she should share it, she started to cry. She says, but I can't. I said, so then you won't. You're entitled to your privacy. We'll get that when we talk about self-disclosure. But that would be classic, sort of mixing the therapist and the mentor part piece. Okay, anything else? Okay. Okay, now here's a very important and little understood point, which is how long do you mentor? If you're assigned a mentee, how long are you going to be the mentor? People's lives go on, especially very often, sometimes the mentors are young people who are, let's say, post-seminary or in Beis Medrash, and their lives take them places, So how long are you going to mentor? The ideal mentoring, according to research, this is coming out of Big Brothers Big Sisters of America, is 1 year. That's the ideal. In fact, sometimes it can be too long. Sometimes it sort of runs out of steam. But here's the interesting point, and this is not often understood. Mentoring under 6 months is at best useless and may even be harmful. There's some data to suggest that if a mentoring relationship is terminated before 6 months, the mentee regresses. Mentee gets actually worse. And if you think about it, it sort of makes sense because it's like a tease. Here you have this very interesting person, this person you're just starting to develop a rapport with, and now the person suddenly leaves you. And we're going to get to this later also. If their lives by nature were very chaotic, here's another abandonment. So I will tell you that again, in the TOVA program, we were school-based. We worked with the schools. We stopped taking referrals in January because the summer came. Kids went off to camp, the mentors went different places. Following year, they may not be around. So we literally stopped taking, we scheduled around the school year. We took referrals from September through December, and then no more referrals. Because too short is actually harmful. That's something very important to keep in mind. And now, also, right from the onset, we make it very clear we're committing ourselves till the end of the academic year. We're committing ourselves for a year. Let the person know right from the onset how long we're committed. And on some rare occasions, when someone desperately needed a mentor and we knew, let's say if it was in March, we knew it would only be 3 months, we would spell out very clearly from the onset. So at least there wouldn't be that disappointment. So it really is important that right from the onset, again, we don't know what life dishes out. We don't know what happens. But it's very important that you notify what the commitment is. And if there has to be a transition, so if you're handing off the baton, it should be, you can transition to a new mentor, but it's very important that the two mentors coordinate. In fact, what we used to recommend, if it was possible, is that the mentee is introduced to the new mentor with the old mentor. And they'd have a few sessions even together, or a few outings together, and then wean away from the old mentors so that the positive regard for the old mentor can be transferred to the new one. But again, the most important point here is mentoring under 6 months is ill-advised. Okay, yes, please. Wonderful question, wonderful question. So the question was that I spoke about people having similar life experiences. What if they don't? And I can tell you this as a therapist. If I had to live the life of everybody I purportedly helped, I would have had to have been a Vietnam War veteran, a Holocaust survivor, we had to have OCD, depression. How can you possibly do that? So there is part of the skill is listening. Part of the skill is what we're going to talk about later, establishing some empathy. So yes, it doesn't have to be. And in fact, sometimes there's a benefit if your life experience was different. because it's an interesting thing. When someone whose life experience was different is able to connect to someone's life experience who's unique, first of all, it's very moving. The perspective any of us can think. All of us have had our pekalach, right? If someone who did not have that same experience was able to somehow say something that really resonated with us, that meant more than someone who went through it already. In fact, sometimes it's also a disadvantage because even though you went through the same experience, you might have experienced it differently. So there's a lot to be said if the experience is different. And this is going to get, again, I'm getting way ahead of myself, but we're going to talk about this later. The other message is, if I, as someone who never, I will tell you personally, I've never been drunk in my life. I drink, but I've never been drunk in my life. My kids are terribly embarrassed about that. That's one of the many things. But not even Purim. I don't get drunk. I'll drink, but I don't get drunk. But if I, who do not have, I have my other problems. I'm not going to, Rachel, keep your mouth shut. Okay, cousin, okay. But but if I, as someone who's not an alcoholic, can connect to this person who has a drinking problem, I'm saying to him, you can be part of mainstream society. You don't have to be in your own little world. So there's a lot of benefits also when there's a different experience, but be very careful to make believe, think that you have the same experience. You have to, that's what we're going to get to later in terms of active listening and how does that happen. But it's a very good question. Thank you for asking. Okay, anything else? Okay, yeah, all the way back there. Okay, you have to scream or someone's going to have to train. I'm not going to hear you. So the question was, so we have to have some mentors who are seeing the same mentee for 4 or 5 years and it's going well, should we switch them out? Yeah, of course, if it's going well, we don't want to continue because that's not the Jewish way. No, I'm sorry. No, of course not, But it can happen. It can happen that the relationship runs out of steam. Relationship just, it's like an old shoe and it's not really constructive anymore. And then sometimes the best thing you can do is back out. Sometimes it gets too familiar. But if it's working well, for sure. Look, many of us have connections with Rebbeim, with Mechanchos, with other types of people who inspired us for years and years. And it's a beautiful experience. So again, measure it, but just keep in mind that sometimes it just gets worn out a little bit. And it's nice and it's comfortable, but they're not really productive. Sometimes new Panim Chadashis is good. Okay, it's a case-by-case decision. Anything else? Okay, so it's a similar question. The way somebody has been through mental illness as medication, someone's been sexually abused. The experiences that, thank God, are rare, and how do you connect to it? So I'm going to talk about this a little bit more later, but I'm going to tell you a personal story, okay? I worked early in my career in a substance abuse clinic, but there were 2 branches of the substance abuse clinic. One was actual substance abuse treatment, and the other one was prevention. Prevention was we took at-risk people and we offered them psychotherapy so they wouldn't resort to drugs. So I was in the prevention departments. I was doing your garden variety psychotherapy. Then crack hit the street. And we were just getting one addict after the other. And the clinic announced, we're closing the prevention department. You're all doing substance abuse treatment. I had no idea. I had no interest in doing substance abuse treatment. And I said, that's not one of my shortcomings. I said, I have plenty. But that's not one of my things. And now I'm going to be working with substance abusers. How am I going to do this? And I remember I was petrified, but I had to put food on the table. I was already starting to pay yeshiva tuitions. I wasn't about to quit. And so I remember thinking to myself, I have a very disgusting habit. I have it ad hayom hazeh. I pick at my cuticles. I don't even realize I'm doing it. Sometimes I'm doing it on Shabbos. I don't even realize I'm doing it. It's a terrible habit. I've tried a million things. There's actually a clinical term for it. I forgot what it's called, but it's one of those like body dysmorphia conditions. And, couldn't find a cure for it, so I'm learning to live with it, but it's a disgusting habit. I said, maybe that's like to be an addict. You want to stop something? You want to stop a behavior, and you can't. Now, to answer your question, to quote Irvin Yalom, there's no human deed or experience that's outside the experience of others. I'm not sure if that's true, but when we search the database of our life's experiences, sometimes we can find that one segue, that one foot in the door to help us understand. And I did work with substance abusers for many years and really got the hang of it, but that was my way in. So yes, sometimes you're going to be facing experiences. Now, there may be experiences that are so removed. We all know that after many years, there may be certain types of conditions that are just so completely outside the realm of what you can relate to, and then you have to say, this is not for me. It is also part of being a mentor. If you're the only one, you do your best. We're going to talk about this a little bit more later, and there is a benefit sometimes to say, I don't get it. Sometimes that's the most empathic thing that you can say. Okay. But you're right, that can be a problem. Okay, let's get some basic precautionary measures. I hope this is not, this may be all implemented, but we'll just go over it quickly. And of course, there's Stephen Wright's famous line, 99% lawyers give the rest a bad name. Okay, hope there are no lawyers here, but okay. Okay, first of all, every mentor must be fingerprinted and vetted, unfortunately. And again, I don't want to belabor the point, but for someone, 99% of people have the best of intentions, but those 1% who don't can ruin the whole program. And you have to make sure that, as best you can, that the motive for being alone with the child is the right motive. So you need to, and by the way, a mentoring program must have liability insurance, and your premiums, I can tell you from personal experience, go down when every mentor is fingerprinted and vetted. And fingerprinted does not mean you read their Hassan Kala resume. I mean, there's a program for that. Okay? Must get parental consent. You cannot mentor a child unless the adults consent. Now, there are sometimes, if it's school-based mentoring, some schools have this blanket consent that parents sign at the beginning of the year, which allows the school to have other school body members meet with the child and help the child without the direct consent of the parents. It's still advisable that the parents know. And by the way, very important, if you are driving the mentee somewhere, we're talking about minors now, you must have specific parental consent that you can take, that their child can be a passenger in your car, and also if there's an email or texting exchanges, parents must know. They don't necessarily know the content, but they must know that you are having these exchanges. You're not having exchanges with a minor without the parent's awareness. If I have a patient who's a minor who texts me, before I answer them, I will text the parent, say, Moshe texted me. Before I answer, I want to make sure it's okay with you if I have that texting relationship. I had a patient, a family that I was assisting, who was going through something very painful as a family. And the daughter was going to seminary in Israel and asked if she can call me if something comes up while she's in Israel. And I said to her, you can call me, but I'm going to let your mother know that we had a phone conversation. I'm not having a phone conversation with someone in seminary without the parent's consent. Very important, because this can, besides the fact that's the right thing to do, it's a necessary precautionary measure. Never meet in a private or isolated setting. Don't meet in the kids' room. Don't go to the park at night. Don't take them to your house or apartment, especially if nobody else is there. Okay? Meetings should be in open public places, and if you're driving, short trips. No 2-hour trips in the car. It's just, again, even though I'm sure all of you have the best, have no intention, no negative intentions. Putting that aside, let's say I was able to ascertain that no one has any kind of destructive intentions. We don't want children to know that it's okay to be alone with an adult 2 hours in a car, or be alone with an adult in a private place. I have a practice now, which I didn't do in earlier years, my practice, but I practice now if I'm seeing a minor in my office, a parent has to be in the waiting room. They can't dump the kid and go shopping. A parent has to be in the waiting room, and the parent and the kid can come in anytime. I'm not worried about myself. I want the message to the child to be clear. You don't just go talk to a stranger without your parents' consent and without your parents' immediate presence. That's the world we live in today. So that's very important. That has to be implemented. Okay? Be careful today. We have to be much more careful today about touch. Arms around, putting the kid on your lap, even the kissing. In today's crazy world, we have to refrain from. You can have a handshake, you can have a fist pump, you can do a high five, whatever. There can be different types of physical contact, but You have to, and this, by the way, men and women, we're not allowing or tolerating as much, for even with well-intended people, because we want the child to know that that's unthinkable. I'll just give you a crazy kind of example. I was doing an orientation for a day camp, and a counselor asked me, we have to put suntan lotion on the children when they go swimming. Rubbing lotion on a child, somebody else rubbing lotion on you should be impossible. And I said, no, tell the parents there should be sprays. And if the parents still bring a lotion, put on a glove, take a napkin, then put it on, for the kids' sake. So again, be careful about these kind of physical contacts. There's confidentiality with limits. We're not going to necessarily share everything the kid says, but there's certain things the kid may say, and we spell that out to them. If the kid is doing anything dangerous, all right, so if the kid is doing hard substances, if the kid is driving while intoxicated, you don't want that on your shoulders. And certainly we'll get to later, we'll talk about what if a kid threatens suicide. And what to communicate to parents. And orient, this is so important. Let them know right from the onset. Here's how it works. This is what's allowed. Tell the parents too. I'm not going to share with you what the kid says. I'm sure you understand, because the child wants to be able to tell me something he might be embarrassed to tell you. But if it's dangerous, and if there's any way that his safety or her safety is compromised, there's no confidentiality. You will know, and I will be in touch with you on how the mentoring is going. I'm not going to totally exclude you. What we did in Tova, by the way, is that we had a social worker, and we had clinical caseworkers, actually some of them were students, social work students, and they were in touch with the parents and the mentors, so whatever needed to be communicated, or just even an assessment of how the mentoring is going, was communicated by this intermediary. So we preserved that relationship with the child, but still were able to keep the parents in the loop. But that's important, and again, just a very quick reminder, there's mandated reporting. I don't want to get into whether it's right, it's wrong, the way it should be. And here in Jersey, the net is much bigger than even New York. Everybody's a mandated reporter. If you hear about abuse, you suspect any kind of abuse. If you fail to report it and it becomes divulged, you're liable. So again, if you're not familiar with this, maybe Debbie Fox will go into it next week, but that's something you have to be aware of. That's the Dina de Malchusa. And just be aware that, and again, you don't have to investigate yourself, but you have to report a suspicion. If you're not sure, by the way, if it's a suffix, what I've often done is called, in our case it's ACS, called them up and said, this is what happened. I don't think it's really anything's going on, but I'm a mandated reporter. And they'll say, no, it isn't. I take down the name of the person, I write in my notes, I'm covered. There are ways, this is something you should be familiar with if you're working with minors. Very good question. This comes up a lot. If you pass it on to your supervisor, are you off the hook? If you are in the room and the supervisor calls protective services, so you can verify that it was done, yes. But just passing it on, and then if the supervisor forgets, then you're liable. That's the way the law is written. So you can pass it on to the supervisor quickly, but you need to be present when the supervisor makes the call. It could be maybe if the supervisor gives you the name and or the ID number of the person, that might be sufficient, I'm not sure. There'll be attorneys who know that very well, and you should probably have somebody who's an attorney, a specialist in this, who you can consult on these matters. If the parent's the abuser, you mean? If it's because of what the parents are doing. Right, then you don't, no, so mandated reporting, you're anonymous, you're protected. You're not, no, the caseworker is not going to identify who made the call. Usually the parents know. I've always informed the parents. So they won't necessarily know, but you make the direct call. You don't call the parents and say, gee, I think something's going on. Now, the other question you might be asking, what if it's a peer? What if it's a school bus driver? That doesn't go to protective services, that goes to police, but the same problems. Okay, so you cannot text, I would tell them this, you make this clear from the start. I'm happy to have a texting connection with you, and I will keep your information the same confidentiality rules that I have regarding verbal communications, but I will not keep it a secret from your parents that we're texting with each other. That's... If it's harmful that they know that you're having a texting connection, I still think it's safer even liability-wise? I think it's safer. It's a good question. Sorry, you may have to ask the POSEC, or whatever. But as a general rule, let's not deal with the exceptions. Parents should know that you're having a texting communication. It's so rare that they have any problem with that. And then that's usually a dysfunctional family anyway. And then make, something, when you're in over your head, there's CHEMED, there's LCSC, did I get it right? Yeah, there are agencies, that's where we go. Okay, anything else? Okay, again, just need to know that. All right. Okay, consistency and boundaries. This is extremely important. Okay, so let me just say here, many individuals who could potentially benefit from mentoring have histories of inconsistent care or presence of others and or fluid or inappropriate boundaries. Those are the kids who are having problems. If you yourself are inconsistent, or if you yourself are not preserving proper boundaries in any way, you're not only not helping, you're triggering the child. So again, here, these can be, but are not limited to, children from homes with high conflict divorce, parental incarceration, physical or mental illness, traumatic disruptions of normal routine, siblings who demand or require enormous parental effort, financial stresses, generational reversals, sexualized conduct with minors and the like. Generational reversals are children who are parenting parents. These are the kind of situations, these are the situations, not the only ones, and as I'm going to get to later, they're kids from this is very important, I'm going to say it a few times. Children from very healthy, appropriate, wonderful homes who need mentoring. Not because there's something lacking in the home, they just need that extra attention for whatever reason. But many do. Many come from these dysfunctional homes and homes where there's these kind of disruptions, and therefore we have to be very consistent. They know Monday afternoon after school you're picking them up and taking them for pizza. It's very important that you're there, and if you're not, that you let them know and let them know the reason why you're not. So that you become a dependable person. We're going to talk later about a corrective life experience. Your dependability, your consistent availability is healing. And your ability to maintain, and by the way, this again is a little complicated what I'm saying, but children who come from homes where there aren't great boundaries will provoke you to break a boundary. And therefore, you have to be very aware of it and be very clear and consistent in terms of what you're doing, what your role is, etc., and not allowing yourself to be sort of, if you will, kind of prompted to overstep a boundary. So this is very important, especially because given the nature of the kind of vulnerable children we're dealing with. Yes? So I can certainly give examples. If you could get a teen, you could get a teen who starts asking you questions about stuff that's inappropriate. Things about your own personal life. Start inquiring. Or on their own. We'll Google your name. And in a very provocative way, start asking you questions about your personal life. And you say, that's not, that's a very private matter. We don't share that. That might be an example. Okay? It might be a kid who will try to, provoke you to get angry at him. And you have to be very clear that's not your position, that's not your job. Or to say, very often, I'm going to get to this later, we're dealing with kids, let's say, who are off the derech, or attempting to, or teetering off the derech. Sometimes they'll tell you things they're doing to see if you can handle it. They want to test you. So they'll say, yeah, you know who I was with last night? Something like that. Or what I did. Or, do you ever rob a store? And he never robbed a store either. But, they want to see whether you can handle them. So those, you have to be very aware of that, and what, So if it's to test you, you'd say, tell me about it. So you're not impressed. I mentioned Googling my name. I just share the story. The first time I ever Googled my name, and up came one of these medical reviews, and it was horrible, saying, Dr. Blumenthal's only in it for the money, he's cold, he's hard-hearted, he doesn't care about his patients, my heart's pounding. I'm saying, which of my patients wrote this? And then at one point he said, he just passes you off on his midwives. I don't have midwives. Okay, for members of this side of the mechitza, if you're ever pregnant and happen to be in Melbourne, Australia, there's a Dr. Norman Blumenthal. Don't use him. He's terrible, you know. Anyway, but that's, you know, okay. All right. So again, for these reasons, consistency and proprietary are in and of themselves therapeutic. See slide 9, corrective life experiences. We'll get to that. While inconsistency and boundary violations can be triggering. Okay, and so dependability, punctuality, we covered this. Mentor must steadfastly remain in his or her role and self-check for their own potential lapses or inadvertently using experiences for personal benefit. That's part of it also. You're in this for them. Yes, you're going to get personal satisfaction, and it is very satisfying. But you're there more for them than for yourself. And if the child senses that you're doing this because you need the ego boost or you need the compliments, they'll sense that, and you may even be sort of triggering them. You may be touching a raw nerve with them. And by the way, here's a very important point. You have to know this, especially if you're dealing with a traumatized population, which you'll be dealing with a lot. The acute sensitive traumatized individuals. Individuals who have been through trauma have X-ray vision. They have a sixth sense. They read us better than people who have not been traumatized, because once they've been traumatized, they're in red alert. In fact, there's a classic study. I probably should be able to show it if I could. They had rows of people's faces showing extremes of emotions. So let's say it would be from sadness to happiness. So the the saddest face would be someone crying profusely. Happiness, someone with an ear-to-ear grin and everything in between. And the person had to identify where was the transition point when it went from sadness to happiness. And they had one row for anger. And kids who were traumatized identified anger or children who were abused, identified anger much earlier than the children who weren't abused. They're scanning, they're looking for it. And they'll pick up on your own vulnerabilities or your own tendencies very quickly. Okay, supervision. All right, in case you can't see that, said, I'm afraid I'll have to reschedule your appointment. Our regular interviewer is home with a broken jaw. Okay, but what supervision is an important part. Okay, there's group or individual supervision, clinical or more seasoned mentor, depends how you structure the program. And you can have, at TOVA, we had a mental health professional supervising it, and with regular scheduled appointments, and of course, they can call on an as-needed basis. I functioned in a tertiary capacity. I was one of the social worker called in case something came up that she felt she wanted some assistance with. And also, putting aside even the advice you might get, it's very good to process the sessions. It's very good to chazer over them. Because if you do, sometimes you might suddenly have insights and understandings that you wouldn't have otherwise. So it's a helpful process, even if the person doesn't, I mean, again, in my work in OVO, when we send people out to do interventions, they come back. Very often they're just telling me about what happened, and I'm just listening, and that things crystallize for the person. So it's a very good process in general. And then there may be clinical issues that come up. So compulsive behavior, self-harm, substance abuse, etc. And by the way, I recommend, and I think it's a good idea, that there should be brief process notes about every session. I say brief, generally speaking, for liability purposes, not good to write too much in case somebody would falsely accuse somebody of something. The more you write, the more they have to hang their hat on, but a very brief summary of each session should be kept and observed. Okay. Now, who are the people who benefit from mentoring? Again, this should be pretty obvious. We'll go through it. So obviously, a child who has an absent or unavailable parent. The whole issue of surrogacy. It's a very interesting that children have a remarkable capacity to substitute parents, especially younger children, but even older children when necessary. And the research on children who were raised in homes where there were unavailable parents or an individual parent who was unavailable benefited from other people taking over those roles. Usually it's better if it's a few people. This would be something, again, if there's a young parent who dies, say a young father dies and there's a child and there's nobody to play ball with him, or for that matter, I remember once one of my patients got divorced and she had, it was a very sudden divorce, and she had a bunch of boys in yeshiva, and so she figured, okay, she'll get an art scroll and she'll help them with Gemara. I have to tell you, reading art scroll, if you haven't learned Gemara, art scroll's not going to help, and she was lost, and therefore again, arranged for people to come, grandparents, uncles, friends, neighbors, to fill those roles, carry the kid on their shoulders and so forth. But it should be a collection of people, because if one has to leave, then that's another loss, okay? Religious struggles, again, those are people who obviously could benefit from mentoring. Presence of mental illness, self-regulation problem, or even the trauma, learning disabilities. Now here's a very interesting cluster. We're seeing more and more of this. This is very current, is the failure to launch child. We're seeing more and more of those, especially since COVID, which is the 26-year-old who still lives at home, isn't going to yeshiva or isn't doing anything, not hired, not working, but can't leave the house. We call them the failure to launch kids. These are now, we're seeing a lot of them, and again, a mentor may be very important in that process of helping them move on and leave the house. And here's maybe the most important point. Needing a mentor is not an indictment of the family. There are kids who just need more tipul. They can come from amazing families. And then sometimes a situation in the family that is not under their control. For example, we know from our work that children who have a sick sibling or a mentally ill sibling that tax the parents, what happens, a very interesting dynamic that happens, is while it's going on, the kid realizes the parents' unavailability is not their fault. They're running to the hospital. They're constantly in emergencies. So the neglect that they have, they don't complain about. They rise to the occasion. They swallow it. But you know what happens? It comes out later. It comes out in young adulthood. It comes out sometimes later in adulthood. That pain and that loss and that resentment of the sick sibling. Now that situation, it's not anybody's fault. If you have a child who needs that much focus, what else are you going to do? Although sometimes we do advise parents, please carve out time for the other children if you can. But again, the presence of a mentor may help in that, may help to give them that help and that assistance that they wouldn't be able to have otherwise. But again, it's not an indictment of the parents, and just people need more. Now here, I want to mention a developmental perspective. Okay, let me just mention in terms, I assume that a large chunk of the kids you're going to be helping are teenagers. So I want to just focus on one aspect of teenage years, and that lends itself to mentoring. Again, most of us don't want to think about teenagers, but all right. But all of childhood, as many of you may know, is a process. Often called the paradox of raising children, which is if you have something very precious, you have a crown jewel, you have a classic piece of art, you're going to protect it, you're going to store it, you're going to put it in a safe, you're going to make sure it's preserved. Yet nothing is more precious to us than our children, and if we do our job right, they leave us. Our whole goal of parenting is to get rid of them. It's we'll go back to Bereshis. Hashem created the family, right? Created Chava, created the family, and the Torah very uncharacteristically stops for an editorial comment and says, Al Ken Yazovish Asaviv Vesimo V'Davak Bishtova Yiluvas Archad. From now on, the child will leave the home. So all of childhood development is a gradual process of becoming your own separate, unique individual. Now, one of the ways in which this takes place during adolescence is what I'm referring to here as the idealization of the extra-familiar figure. So let me describe to you what it's like. I remember going through it now. I'm seeing it in my grandchildren. But, your kid adores you, right? You're a psychologist, he's going to be a psychologist. You're a Met fan, he's a Met fan. You go to Seder at night, he's going to go to Seder, everything you do. And then he's around 13, 14, right? And you send him to camp. And you come up for visiting day, and he has this 16-year-old counselor. And this guy is the best thing that's ever happened since white bread. He's amazing, and he's great, and you're going to do this. And now, you were at that 16-year-old's bris, what am I? And suddenly but that's very normal adolescent behavior. That during adolescence, they seek out alternative figures to idealize. So that's why at this age, very often they get very close to the Rebbe or to the Mechanechas. Very often they may even take fictional characters. And when you go into, let's say, a typical public school kid's room, you'll see rock stars all over the, all over their, posters of rock stars. So they look for alternative figures because that's their attempt to become their own unique individual. We take advantage of that with mentoring. And by providing the mentoring, if they're going to idealize someone outside the family, it's better it's you guys than some ball player. So that's why we're taking advantage, and that's the prospect, that's why the developmental piece, particularly with adolescents, okay? Also, adolescents are more autonomous. Now, just the last point, I guess I'm not going to get to everything, but this is very important. The capacity to look at yourself, this is very important. The capacity to see yourself only really develops in adolescence. Some of you may be familiar with Piaget, the very famous psychologist who studied how children think. He did one very interesting study. He took a child, he created a movie set, and he put the child at one end of this movie, like a show to town. He put the child all the way at one end, and he was at the other end. And he said to the child, "What do you see?" And the child said, "Describe what he saw." "I saw a building, I see a railway station, I see a park," okay? Now, they said, "Now tell me what I see." So the child would have to sort of leave himself and see the world from someone else's perspective. That capacity only develops in adolescence. So to look at the world from someone else's perspective comes when the brain develops during adolescence. But that's why it doesn't make sense to me, in preschool, right? Reuven punches Shimon in the nose. Shimon is crying. Teacher says to Reuven, "How would you like it if Shimon punched you in the nose?" Well, that's a stupid question. I punched him in the nose. That ability to leave yourself and see the world from someone else's perspective only develops in adolescence. Now, that's why in adolescence you have an identity. What's your identity? How the rest of the world looks at you. So when we talk about who I am, we're really describing how the world looks at us, and that happens in adolescence. Now, when you're mentoring an adolescent, that's the age when you can say, you're a very impulsive kind of guy, or you're a very spontaneous person, or, you don't like authority too much. And you can help the kid understand himself. That's not going to work with a preschool age child, a pre-adolescent child. Okay, questions? We're doing okay? Okay? All right. Okay, now here's another interesting aspect of mentoring. And we deal with this, especially those of us in the mental health field deal with this all the time. A kid is screaming that he needs therapy. He's acting out, he's fighting, he's miserable, he doesn't want to go to school, nothing. And of course you say, well, you have to see a therapist. And b'shum ofen, that's the last, especially if the kid is already feels stigmatized, last thing he wants is that he has to see a mental health professional. Now, by the way, that's partly why a mentoring is good, because mentoring doesn't have the same stigma. It's some cool guy who he's going to shoot some basketball hoops with. Well, there's no stigma with that. But when you have to go to some guy my age and sit and talk about your personal problems, that's no way. And it's very risky business to force someone into therapy, because what happens is they don't benefit, and then they get soured on the whole therapy thing. So when they're older and more mature and would be receptive, you can't get them to go. So it's not a great idea unless you really absolutely have to. But sometimes when I get these calls, my kid needs therapy, I don't know what to do, he won't go. So a few things we can do. But one of them, sometimes I suggest, is let's get him a mentor. Now, he needs more than a mentor. But the mentor, first of all, doesn't have the stigma. Also, I'm introducing him to the idea that you can have a connection with another adult and you can benefit. So it's a step towards therapy. So sometimes mentoring can actually be the segue to a therapy referral. And by the way, if the mentor, who's this cool guy, who really gets him, who knows all the things he's interested in, who's a great ball player, if this guy starts talking about therapy, maybe there's something to it. So it's a way sometimes for the treatment resistant to really need therapy. But again, mentor has to keep in mind he's not a therapist. Even if the kid needs therapy and you're seeing him, and the mentoring, by the way, can continue also once the person's in therapy. Okay, what works? What is there about mentoring that works, okay? So help with less or no stigma. Pragmatic assistance, okay? Tutoring, coaching, skill instruction. Now, the art of attentive listening. I can't, again, this is something that almost doesn't make sense. I want to tell you, as a kid, I could never imagine a psychologist being tired. Because, a bricklayer is tired. He's got up and down the ladder and the bricks are heavy. But a guy who sits all day and just talks to someone, how's that exhausting? Those of us in the field know. At the end of our day, I can't even read a stop sign. I'm exhausted because listening is hard work. And that's important part. And even to answer your question earlier about how do you understand something that's outside the realm of your experience, you listen with that third ear. That intent listening is a skill and doesn't come easy. If you're not sweating at the end of a session, if you're having a conversation with, for that matter, your mentee or your spouse, you're not listening. And that's, it's that classic story, the kid who comes home from school, right, and is telling his mother something, the mother's cooking and cleaning, and he keeps saying, Ma, you're not listening. I say, yes, I'm listening, and she's patching around the stove, and he finally says, but Ma, you're not listening with your eyes. You got to look for the facial grimaces, and you got to listen to the change, the body language. All that's very important, and that's listening. In fact, there's a technique. I thought I alluded to it here. Maybe I alluded to it later. There's a family therapy technique called PrEP, which is very interesting. It's used in marital therapy, where let's say Avraham says something to Sarah. Sarah then has to paraphrase what Avraham said until Avraham is convinced that she gets it. Sounds easy, right? Try it tonight with your spouse. We role-played it. We barely got past the second sentence. But that's very important part, and so that's a very big chunk, is actively listen, and don't fill in, and hear the messages between the lines. Also, especially if you're dealing with someone who's traumatized, part of healing from trauma is telling over the story. I can't tell you how many times in my office I have someone I even had a few Iraq veterans, people who've been through terrible trauma. They come to my office, they tell over what happened, and I'm just listening. Maybe I ask a question or two for clarity, but I'm basically just listening. At the end of the session, they gladly pay my exorbitant fee. I often tell my patients, I could never afford myself, but they pay my fee and they thank me profusely. And I feel like a charlatan. What did I do? But saying over, telling over, and there's reasons anatomically even why that works, is extremely important. And if a kid is telling you over something that they've been through, you don't have to give advice. Just listening to it and buying and accepting it as a legitimate description of what happened is very healing. Okay? Don't clarify for clarity before advice. And then another one. Okay, here's a very important part. I want to tell you an interesting psak I heard from no less a personage than Reb David Cohn. A number of years ago, I was running a program. We took clinicians, so this was back when Kids Off the Derech was a hot topic. We put them up in a hotel for 2 days, and we had different groups, and we composed actually a manual. Some of you may have seen it. And Reb David Cohn, Shlita, was going around from room to room fielding halachic questions. And in one group, one of the clinicians asked, if in your first session with a patient, with a kid, he tells you he's Mechal Shabbos, what should you do? And Reb David said, it is usur to challenge his Chil Shabbos. Because you're going to ruin the relationship. Yes, ultimately you have to make him Shomer Torah mitzvahs. But at this juncture, you're building up the relationship. If you challenge him right away, you're going to lose him. So you may hear things that are jarring, and may hear things that just give you heartburn. Especially early on, you have to hear it and listen to it. Yes? Same idea. I'm glad he's consistent. Okay. Because I really made up the other stories, so now I feel good. Yeah. Oh, she meant to bring up the topic. Okay, that's a very good question. Should the mentor bring up topics that he knows the mentee's going through? I'll give you, I think it's a case by case, but I'll give you my best answer, and I'm going to answer it a little differently. The better the connection, the relationship, the more you can go out on a limb. So if you're aware of something and you know it's a sensitive topic and it's your first or second or third visit, I might not. You just don't report. If you already have that connection, then you can go and say, listen, I just heard something. Now, if he knows you were informed, then I would let him know that I was informed about this. I'm sure you know that your mom wanted you to have a mentor because, she caught you texting on Shabbos or whatever. Okay, so I just want you to know I'm aware of that. And if you want to talk about it, talk about it. If you don't want to talk about it. I just don't want to make believe like I don't know. But if you want to bring it up, let's say it's not brought up and it's a little bit later in this, hey, I want to talk a little bit about this texting business, Shabbos. You can do that when you have already a strong rapport. I hope that answers whoever was submitted the question. Okay. I'm picking out here things, but okay, now that's one more thing also, by the way. You have to also preserve your dignity and who you are. So if the kid comes along and tells you, yeah, when my parents had to sleep Friday night after, Friday night Shabbos, I stole their car keys and I went on a joyride, you may not want to say, oh, it's not like that. Well, maybe that's already a little dangerous, okay? Or I went downstairs on the computer and I went in certain sites or something like that. But you don't mind say, hey, that sounds cool. Tell me about it. I want to hear more about it. No, that's overstepping your boundary. You listen, you hear, you understand. You remember, you remind yourself that you were young once also. All these types of different, I'm reminded it's appropriate to tell the story, but my Rebbe here in Lakewood was Rav Kreiser, Zichron Livracha. I was in his shir for 3 years when I was in YU. I remember once he was giving us Musar, and he was talking to us about all, because we'd be blown away by him, as you can imagine. How can we ever, and he would say, listen, what do you want? I just learn all day. You guys have so much pressure, you have college, you have to get into graduate school, you have to go to shir, you have to, and then at one point he said, so we're a bunch of immature 19-year-olds, we started laughing. And he goes, so yeah, you can relate to the fact that you were also once young, but you don't overstep your boundary. You preserve your own dignity as well. And one more thing, again, Moshe, how much time should I keep going? 5 minutes, okay. We're not going to get to everything. Here's the last line, validation. David Pelkowitz likes to point out that the word ishur, confirmation, is also the word ashrei, which is happy. There's something very powerful when you feel validated. And I'm sure we've all had that experience. There's something, that's one of the benefits of like this weekend we're doing, or groups, where you don't feel weird, you don't feel different because of the experience, the response you're having. And if you can validate the experience, if the mentee brings up something, and even if you don't agree, and if you don't think it's a great idea, but you can say, I can understand why that would be important. I can understand where that would be valuable. I can understand that after you've been so disappointed so many times by adults, why you'd be turned off. When you validate, that's very gratifying, and that forms a connection. So validate, again, not without it. You can also, I remember once, Pesach Krohn once called me, and he said to me, I'm going to speak in a community about kids off the derech, and the rule of thumb is unconditional love, right? I said, yeah, unconditional love, but not unconditional approval. Oh, he said it was great, and he's going to quote me, and he's going to use it in his Tisha B'Av speech, and I don't know if he did or didn't, but that's an important differentiation. I may not approve, but I still love you, and I may understand it. It's not so hard to understand. I can understand, especially if I came from your vantage point. So validating, but truly validating, is really, I can't begin to tell you how important that is. How many times people have come to me? Some people might have some sort of grief response, and everybody's telling them it's time to get over it, or you shouldn't respond that way. And I tell them, of course you're responding that way. Of course. What else? What do you expect? It's so comforting. So again, that needs to be a very important part of mentoring. Okay. All right. Again, It's relationship, relationship, relationship. That's what's important. Once you've established that connection and relationship, again, within the right boundaries, there's so much more you can do. Okay, so build trust, the relationship. Okay, expect the mentee to be wary at first. Especially they may have had a lot of life experiences where people were not trustworthy. Okay, a lot of this we covered. Okay, they may. Okay, also understand there's a theme: 2 steps forward, 1 step backwards. There's progress, and then there's retreat. And in fact, it's very interesting. I'll tell you experience I've had very often. I'm supervising a resident or an intern who's just learning these techniques. And they have this amazing session with a patient and with huge insights. And they come and they're all excited. And at the end of the supervision, I'll say to them, now I'm warning you, next week they're going to talk about the weather. Or they're going to talk about the Mets. Because when you take a risk, you retreat. So you might have an amazing session with the mentee, and he may share things with you, or she may share things with you, and then they'll retreat. Okay, the stronger the connection, the more risks that can be taken. Okay, let me move ahead. Okay, the art of listening. If you can't see that card, I can't even see it on mine, but I think it says, here we go. He says, I'm sorry, dear, I wasn't listening. Could you repeat everything you've said since we've been married? Okay. You got to do this because, all right. So this we talked about active listening. So we did this already. Okay, this is what we did already. Okay, moving ahead. Okay, let's talk empathy and sympathy, and then that's an important topic. Well, I'll show how much more we can do. Well, I'll either be stopped by motion or my computer will conk out. I don't think there's an outlet here, is there? There is one. Yeah, can you get me that white plug? There's a white plug in my bag, in that gray bag. If you see that white plug, you can raid my bag. Okay, just leave the marijuana there. Don't take it. Oh no. Okay. Okay. Let me tell you an empathy test that I do as a therapist. Well, first of all, let's differentiate between sympathy and empathy. Okay? So you see it in the diagram here. Sympathy is, I feel bad for you, but I don't know what it's like to be you. Perfect, yeah. Empathy is noseba'ol. It's really going in and living this person, living the life as a person. Huh? After this we stop? Empathy is putting yourself, now I want to tell you, what's the empathy test? I do this all the time as a therapist, and I think you can do this as a mentor as well. I do the following. When I'm either reflecting on a session or maybe even during a session, I say to myself, if I were this person and I lived his or her life, would I be any different? And to the extent that I can say no, I can help the person. That's empathy. People don't come to us for help from nominal things. They come to us for help with serious matters. And our job is as best as we can, like my picking at my cuticles, enter their world. Sometimes when I'm a therapist, I feel like I'm a tourist. I walk into the depression world, grief world, trauma world. I visit different worlds. And that's the job of, that's the ultimate, that's empathy. And if you can say something empathic, that's the validating. It's so powerful. So if you have, here I'm going to say this. I remember a mashgiach once telling me that the mashgiach has to be a bigger ganav than the ganav. He said when he walks into a kitchen of a restaurant and the guy says, oh, Rabbi, come here, let me show you this. He looks the other way and he finds the tarfus. You have to think like someone who's cheating. If you're going to work with kids, and I'm going to say something very controversial, I usually say that for the end, so maybe I'll get banished from Lakewood, and but if you want to understand a kid who's struggling with his frumkeit, get in touch with your struggles, with your frumkeit. And if you want to help a kid who is angry at his parents, be in touch with anger you may have at your parents, or as much as you can, but allow yourself to enter their world as much as you humanly can, and that's the hardest work, and that's the challenge of helping other people, because you may have to go into worlds that are not very pleasant. That's why I say that's why I feel like a tourist. Baruch Hashem, I come home. And by the way, that's why it's important also to process. because you're going to, the people who are experiencing difficulties will touch pieces of yourself that you don't and you wouldn't have to face if you weren't doing this work. So it's very important afterwards to have that processing. But I'm going to conclude actually with a story, which is how I learned what empathy really is. And I think that's a very important point, and then maybe that will conclude. I was an intern, and my dissertation, I'm a child of a Holocaust survivor, and my dissertation was on children of Holocaust survivors, and I was accepted on an internship that had a unit for psychiatrically hospitalized children of Holocaust survivors. Some fascinating stuff we did. And the unit chief was a Dr. Sylvia Axelrod, who was a contemporary of the survivors. American-born, Jewish in name only, but she was a contemporary of the survivors. And the word we published and word got out, and there was an affiliate hospital that had a Holocaust survivor who was psychiatrically hospitalized. So they called us in as consultants. And the format at that time was, she was the consultant, I was the source's apprentice. I was the Mitschlepper, as they say in Latin. But I was a young kid, I was an intern, And they called her in, and the format was the staff would present their concerns, and then the consultant would interview the patient, and then they'd discuss it. So the staff presented, they said, we have this Holocaust survivor. The thinking at that time was you have to get them to speak about what they went through. We keep asking her about her experience in the Holocaust, and she poo-poos it. It was nothing to talk about. Didn't make any sense to them. So they called in Dr. Axelrod, Sylvia Axelrod, to be the consultant. So Sylvia calls out the patient. They sit down together, and she's talking to her about her hospitalization, her medication, everything. Then at one point, she said to her, I understand you survived the Nazi concentration camps. She goes, yeah. So she said, I just want you to know that as an American who never lived through anything like that, there's no way I can know what that is like. And the woman started to cry and say, finally someone who understands. And I was watching this and saying, that's empathy. Part of empathy is to realize, hayesh machov k'machovi, try as hard as you can. And you have to try. And give yourself that empathy test. There'll always be a piece that you can't understand. In fact, and this is an important lesson if you're dealing with people who are suffering. All suffering comes with loneliness. There's pieces of it that you can never, ever, nobody else can ever understand. In fact, Rabbi Soloveitchik in a piece once wrote, we say every Chodesh Elul, Yaviv v'mi azavuni v'Hashem yasfeni. My mother and father abandoned me and Hashem gathered me. I say, he never understood that pasuk. What mother and father abandons a child? He said he had serious surgery in the 50s. They weren't sure if he'd even survive. He said the night before his surgery, when his family said goodbye to him, he said he finally understood that pasuk. Because there are situations in life when even those closest to you, they can't understand you. And as he put it, I'm a lonely being, in lowercase, facing the loneliest being. Only Hashem can understand. But that's an important part. So you have to try, you have to approach empathy. You can never achieve empathy. We got a lot done, okay? I appreciate your patience. There was Ritalin in the Danishes and sushi, by the way, if you're wondering why you were able to pay attention as well as you did. And hopefully we'll meet again and we'll cover some more topics.